Hello, and welcome to Mayor Brown's podcast series, Credibly Challenged. This podcast focuses on risk management issues for financial institutions of all sizes, particularly those in the banking sector. My name is Matt Bazance, and I'm a partner in Mayor Brown's financial services, regulatory, and enforcement practice. Joining me today is Dan Feldman. Dan is the head of enterprise and retail risk management for CIBC's U.S. region. On today's program, we'll talk about managing risks of complex products and how to add value through knowing the business. Thanks for being with us, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me, Matt. It feels like a good time to talk about risk management. We're seeing major equity indices near bear market territory. A lot of high-profile earnings misses this quarter as companies are grappling with numerous headwinds. And the macro headwinds we're seeing today, which feel like the truly generational in nature, could manifest in numerous ways affecting multiple risk stripes. So now's as good a time as any to focus on risk management.
Great. Well, to get started, let's take a step back. And can you tell me a little bit about the risk management function at CIBC, particularly given its global presence?
Sure thing. And maybe just a little bit of background. I've been at CIBC for 25 years across different areas of risk management. My initial focus was on credit risk management around our high yield trading operations. And then I moved into more traditional credit adjudication of leverage lending and specialty verticals like utilities, project finance, and oil and gas. I was also responsible for assessing our investment portfolios, including our merchant banking positions, from both a risk and evaluation perspective.
Mhm.
And about 9 years ago, I began focusing more on the other risk stripes, so outside of credit risk, looking at liquidity, market, operational, reputation, and strategic risks. I worked on building our frameworks and policies as well as our Reg YY program. I developed our risk appetite statements, and I built out our US risk governance. Along the way, I received my MBA from NYU Stern School of Business. I'm based out of New York. I have a team of 30 risk professionals in New York and Chicago. So as it relates to CIBC, I think of it in terms of concentric circles. So the outermost circle is enterprise-wide risk management. So how our three lines of defense interact and come together to manage and report and escalate risks throughout our organization. And within that circle is our independent risk management, which is comprised of risk and compliance, and it's led by our chief risk officer. And independent risk management basically designs and facilitates our framework, including our risk appetite program. We establish and monitor adherence to risk limits. We aggregate risks and independently assess our bank's risk profile. We report on risk data and assessments to management and our boards. And finally, we independently challenge decisions and activities within the lines of business. When we built our US risk management program, we identified roughly 20 pillars of risk, which is a lot broader than the 7 core risk stripes I referenced earlier. And it would include things like digital risk, conduct risk, et cetera. We then look to build out our US coverage of each of those pillars, and our risk professionals ultimately report into our US CRO,
Mhm.
and our risk leaders also have dotted line accountability into Canada, as we're a large foreign banking organization operating in the US. But we also have plenty of autonomy
Mhm.
to meet our obligations in the US, focusing in on US regulatory and other requirements. When we built out our CROs and executive job responsibilities, we crafted them to meet all tenets of Reg YY,
Mhm.
and we govern in accordance with the applicable regulatory guidance.
Well, that's an impressive journey you took, moving from credit risk initially to the other financial risks, and now covering what it sounds like are some of the non-financial risks. That is an expansive portfolio that you've grown over the years. And you're right that we hear from a number of foreign banks about the complexity of Reg YY and other U.S. regulations that don't always align perfectly with with their home country or their global structure, and the need to have professionals like yourself who know how to tailor them, who know how to, in some ways, force alignment through organizational practice. Um, and maybe do you have any more insight around how you do work with your Canadian colleagues on aligning that risk management?
Yeah, so it's really a balance. We absolutely look to our home office for guidance on risk management practices. I would say that's often the starting point, but we focus on US risk management expectations. And the point there is to ensure we have strong capabilities and we're meeting all US laws and regulations. If I have to create a new framework in the US, I typically start with our parent framework and see if that can work for us in the US. But if not, I'll turn it into a US supplement or even a US standalone framework. That enables us to align with the parent and then solve for the various US nuances that you just referenced. And our organizational structure with the dotted line relationships, there's really no risk of our charting our own course.
Mhm.
We sometimes build a capability in one of our regions and then roll it out across the enterprise or vice versa.
When you were talking about risk identification and aggregation and the other aspects of your job, it got me thinking about what are sort of the top things on your plate or on your dashboard as far as like what's the top risk for the U.S. region or maybe the most important emerging risk.
I would say cybersecurity is the top risk. While it's one of the operational risk categories, if it were to manifest, it would affect us in numerous ways from a strategic perspective, i.e., our client interactions and our ability to grow. From a reputation impact, that's pretty clear. And then there's potential liquidity ramifications, et cetera. But it's interesting, going back decades, if the answer to this question was typically credit risk, and while that's still a big risk for lenders, particularly in this uncertain macro landscape we're in, it just goes to show you how things have shifted when you hear people say cyber or AML or operational resiliency as their top risks.
Mhm.
As it relates to most worrisome emerging risks, I would say it's the confluence of generational factors at play. So when I think of the inflationary environment, high commodity prices, supply chain dynamics, labor force issues, heightened geopolitical concerns, and then think about the average age of first line staff across the financial services industry. I obviously don't have the data on me, but I would surmise that the vast majority of first and second line staff have only experienced these events through school textbooks.
Mhm.
And to see all of these factors hitting at the same time, with the Fed aggressively looking to tamp down inflation, to me, that's the most worrisome emerging risk. And I don't think anyone really knows how this is going to play out. Soft landing would be great, but you heard Chairman Powell last week say, that it's difficult to predict whether they'll be able to drive a soft landing for the economy. And to that end, our CRO, both global and the US, are constantly asking us to spend time thinking about what's around the corner, have that forward looking perspective into those unknown risks, managing risks with a forward looking perspective. So learn from the past, but don't get bogged down by it. When I think of the financial crisis of 0809, what that taught us were several valuable lessons. And during severe dislocations, all the flex in the world won't be able to move paper.
Right.
And what you might think is strong investment grade
Mhm.
paper or even AAA can be a mirage under certain scenarios. So those lessons have us constantly looking, and perhaps it's a fruitless endeavor, but we're constantly looking for those unknown or emerging known risks.
It's interesting. My first job, I started at it between Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers back in 2008, and I was fresh out of school at the time, and I did not have an appreciation of what was about to happen or what was happening around me. That I read it in the headlines. I even saw when Lehman Brothers went under, I saw the people walking in the streets of New York City. I was based there at the time, and I saw the people leaving the buildings with all of their boxes. And being a young new professional at the time, I didn't realize just what that would mean for the next 4 or 5 years of the economy, the job market, um, the difficulties finding jobs, and just all of the ramifications it would have. And now being in a professional financial services sector and having seen some of the more modest ones that I don't think the COVID had the same effect on the banking sector that the 2008 financial crisis had. But seeing where risks start to creep up, and now seeing it now, like you said, with inflation, it is a new experience. It is something that I have not had a lot of personal interaction with since back when I got out of school. Um,
Precisely.
yeah. So turning to another topic or another risk that you didn't mention it, but it's one that I hear a lot about and that we're engaging on more here at the firm. It's ESG risk and thinking about where that fits into the framework for a bank like CIBC. What types of ways you're approaching particularly climate risk as part of ESG?
ESG is very important to our organization. Our CEO, Victor Dodig, is quite passionate about it, but it's an extremely broad category. By my count, there are at least 10 components just within the environmental, at least 15 components within the social pillar, and at least 10 within the governance pillar. I have a team that's responsible for ESG from a risk management perspective. But like you said, they're spending the majority of their effort on the financial risks from climate change. But ultimately, the full breadth of our ESG practices are driven by multiple groups across our bank. We have an ESG oversight group in Canada, legal, risk management, HR, and others. And as I said, my team is most focused on executing on the climate aspect, given the evolving regulatory expectations. And there's clear momentum and focus from a White House and a congressional standpoint. I've often say that climate change and the financial risks from that will be an emerging risk for many years to come.
Mhm.
So we're building our risk management capabilities there. We're staying apprised of external developments. We're having regular conversations with our peers and fourth parties as we build our program. It feels like the industry is converging into basically an interagency regulatory view. So
Mhm.
that's good. And we've been watching closely some of the developments in other jurisdictions, particularly Europe, which had a head start, just to give ourselves a head start here in the US.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated when I talk to my European colleagues that things over there seem significantly more prescriptive than they are in the US, and even around things like ESG risk, the amount of quantification that they're requiring, the robustness that different regulators are coming in with, where in the US we've just started with some of our disclosures. I think most of it is still voluntary, particularly on the disclosure side. I know the OCC and others are moving more towards some prescriptive risk management practices, but it is good to see that you guys are on the front of the at least the US curve of building out that capabilities, that having that in-house capability to manage new risks and understand them, that's uh, for professionals like myself, unfortunately, that's a very cost efficient way to do things because it saves you on spending a lot for lawyers and consultants who then you have to try to translate their work into your organization. So that's good for you.
And when you see what's going on from a regulatory and an agency perspective, you look at the SEC, the OCC, the FDIC, and the Fed, quite focused on stress testing. We'll catch up to our European colleagues pretty quickly.
Yeah. So you seem to have a really good handle on a wide range of risks from the operational aspects of cyber to the financial aspects of climate. But like you said, you originally had a background in credit risk and credit activities. How did you make that transition? What was it like for those who might be considering a similar transition?
I found the transition wasn't that difficult. All those years in credit risk focused on analyzing companies, assessing valuations, and writing credit standards and guidelines really helped with that transition. When I was in credit risk, I would look at a new deal basically every couple of weeks. And when you have to do that, you basically have to learn everything about that company, that vertical, do my own diligence, assess the various threats, and really dive into those companies and industries, and then ultimately present that to our senior committees. And that whole process taught me a solid analytical and presentation skills, and how to quickly assess a situation and make a decision that aligned with our risk appetite and our credit standards and guidelines. So that really helped me turn my attention to the other core risk stripes. And without really knowing it, I was literally starting to build our US ERM program about 7 years ago.
Mhm. Now you've moved up through more senior roles as you've built that program, and you're now the head of enterprise and retail risk management. How do you maintain that connection with the business lines? How do you maintain that involvement in the product knowledge that served you so well earlier in your career?
I once heard one of our directors define strong risk culture as collaboration, and that's really stuck with me over the years. So I don't view ERM or risk management for that matter as a siloed practice. It should be integrated. For example, strategy setting, it is basically it's imperative that as we set our strategy, it's done with ERM at the table, right? So ERM should work with the strategic team in the formation of the strategic plan. When I think of credit risk, I think credit risk managers should go out to meet clients, they should go to bank meetings, and they should be brought into the loop well before a credit comes in for adjudication. Operational risk, they should directly work with our colleagues through the risk control self-assessment program with a focus not just on measuring and identifying, but also controlling and mitigating risks. We basically created a risk ID program to respond to Reg YY requirements. And we spent a lot of time educating our first line that this isn't an ERM risk ID program. We developed a program, we created a framework, and we're giving you this tool to basically enable your bottoms up analysis and risk assessment. So I personally stay engaged by having standing meetings with my first line colleagues. And I also like to run point on projects that require first and second line collaboration. And those are the best ways to show the first line we're equal partners in protecting our bank and doing the right thing for all of our stakeholders.
That's great to hear that collaboration. Sometimes I hear people express concerns about the second line or the third line becoming too close to the business and around the importance of maintaining independence while also adding value beyond just risk management. How do you walk that tightrope of collaborating with the business, helping them add value to the bottom line, but also staying as the independent second line function?
Yeah, so we maintain our independence. As our CRO reports directly into the risk committee of the board and its chair. We also ensure independence and strong effective challenge by having both 2A and 2B lines of defense perspective. So for example, I look at our credit risk adjudication team as more of a 2A, but in ERM, we can certainly challenge our credit risk standards and guidelines. We can challenge limits and our strategy as I sit on our credit risk committee. So independence and expertise in products and services aren't necessarily mutually exclusive concepts. Yes, the first line owns the risks and they have to be an expert in their respective businesses, but ultimately we expect our risk management staff to be just as versed in all of those products and services, which is why we're big proponents of rotations throughout the organization. I like to see first line colleagues moving into the second line and vice versa. And I also think it's important for those who are originating credit to spend some time in our workouts area. I think a lot of lessons learned there. So when every day I come to work and I ask myself, how can I add value? We take risks every day, and it's our job to facilitate and challenge that risk taking. No one's going to buy a sports car without an excellent braking system, and how all those components of a car work together is really analogous to a well-run financial institution. We expect the first line to know when to apply the brakes, and we will come in as a risk organization and press the emergency brake, hopefully in rare circumstances.
You have a pretty sophisticated view of how how the risk management framework operates and how the different pieces of it come together. That I've heard some people talk about it as the lines of defense, breaking it down to like the 1.5, which is similar to your 2A, 2B concept. And everyone builds it a little differently, but but that's something I'd like to talk a little bit more about because you've mentioned a few times about the Reg YY piece of things as being a driver in the U.S., but there aren't a ton of U.S. laws that are around specific risk management practices. Certainly, nowhere near what they have in Europe. So when you are designing these things like the 2A 2B construct or some of the other emergency brakes you're talking about, where are you looking for guidance on that kind of structure?
Yeah, so there's solid regulatory guidance out there. I mentioned Reg YY, Enhanced Prudential Standards, which captures broad risk management, governance, and particularly liquidity management. There's also SR 9551, which describes sound risk management, basically around four components. So active board and senior management oversight. So basically your organization and governance. The second component is having adequate policies, procedures, and limits. So the how and the what we can do. The third component of 9551 is having adequate risk measurement, monitoring, and MIS, so the data and reporting side. And then there's obviously, for all that to work, you need comprehensive internal controls to drive sustainability. There's also SR 193, which focuses in on how the Fed looks at us and ensuring capital planning, liquidity, risk management, and governance and controls
Hmm.
are aligned with the size and complexity of an organization and rated accordingly. Then you have the OCC heightened expectations, which came out of the financial crisis. And we're constantly watching for changing regulatory guidance. We're watching the soon to come interagency guidance on third party risk management, as an example. And through the ongoing feedback loop between ourselves and the second line, as well as our third and fourth lines of defense, we try to stay ahead of the curve. So and it's not just looking at the guidance, we'll also act based on events, whether those are internal or external threats, such as experiencing a large operational loss or disruption, or witnessing a macro event or what's happening to other financial institutions. That could spur actions on our part.
Hmm. That now the 95 in 9551 that you're talking about dates that back to 1995. So certainly risk management has been a priority for a long time, but in recent years, I've seen an increasing emphasis on documentation when you talk about the risk identification program, when you're talking about some of the assessment activities that are conducted by both the first and in some cases the second line that yeah, I spend a lot of my day on spreadsheets now for risk management functions, trying to build out control mappings and things like that. And I would not have expected that even 10 years ago. But how do you strike a balance of managing the risks in the way you talk about of really being engaged substantively in these collaborative conversations, but also documenting them to the level expected by regulators, by the industry, or even by your board and independent assessors? So how do you keep that balance going?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance. I'd say the complexity of risk frameworks really depends on obvious the size and complexity of an organization. As I think of our own US ERM framework, it's literally doubled in size over the last 7 years. And frameworks to procedures and training isn't necessarily linear. So we've seen a material increases in those types of documents over the years. And we've definitely seen a big push for more documentation, which can sometimes be hard to balance, as you said, when you're trying to be agile or radically simple. At the end of the day, managing risk is the most critical element. That's what I focus on day in and day out, in addition to effective challenge. But we need to ensure the other elements are there and they're captured. So the reporting, the escalation, and the documentation. So my team is responsible for risk committee reporting to our board. And we really have to balance what our directors are looking for to enable their effective oversight. We're balancing what our regulators expect to see to get a strong perspective into our organization, our oversight, and our risk culture. And we're also balancing what management wants to see as they assess how it's all coming together. My ultimate goal, as I said, is to manage risk effectively. As you said, we can't lose sight of all the requisite reporting and documentation of our risks and processes.
I think there's also sometimes a pressure in risk management, not only around the effectiveness, but around the efficiency side of things. And there's two camps of the one camp is people who want to identify every risk, make sure the risk register is, maybe thousands of items long at some institutions, or the legal requirements inventory is thousands of items long to get every possible risk or requirement that could require a control be developed. And then there's the other side who is reminding that all of our institutions, the law firm I work for, or your bank, everyone has limited resources, and you need to, as a senior leader, deploy those resources in an efficient manner. So how do you manage that materiality or that efficiency aspect of risk management?
It's interesting. You said thousands. I've heard people say infinite risks across an organization.
Yeah.
The reality is there's probably millions of risks, and I could theoretically write a 25,000 page board report to document all of them. But spending time, like you said, to identify and report on every single risk is obviously a pointless exercise. We focus in on the material risks across baseline and stress scenarios, and then we set out to monitor and mitigate those risks while establishing obviously appropriate KRIs and KPIs to capture those risks. These are point in time identification of risks. What could be material today could be immaterial in the future, or vice versa. So we focus on those risks that are material to our business today and our strategic objectives, whether they're known or emerging, and then we try to assess them against their likelihood, velocity, and the potential impact to our organization.
That's good to hear. That's a pretty constructive way to do things, and I think it's an approach I've heard others take of focusing on the material risks in that way. Uh, Another conversation I've had with several people is around risk quantification, and it's related to that efficiency thing of that efficiency issue of, while measuring risk is important, and understanding it in a granular level, sometimes people prefer qualitative metrics instead of quantitative ones, just because of the cost or burdensome nature of quantifying certain aspects of risk, particularly as your portfolio has expanded over the years to include some of the non-financial risks. How do you make that quantitative versus qualitative decision?
I think all material risks should be measured both quantitatively through metrics and qualitatively as well. So our risk appetite statements have both elements, and we also measure our conformance to those qualitative elements as well, not just the metrics. Some risks are definitely harder to come up with a metric for, and there have been situations throughout my career where I've literally stared at something for weeks and just couldn't come up with an obvious metric to capture that risk. And then finally it clicked. And the categories there that are often harder are strategic risk and risk culture. But if you think outside the box and focus, there are metrics that will make sense for someone's organization. The challenge with strategic, though, is that most metrics you come up with are generally performance-like in nature. They're not really true risk appetite statements. So for example, let's say an organization wanted to grow their loans at 10% CAGR, and that's a strategic focus for that organization. So I could set a risk appetite metric for loan growth greater than, let's say, 9%, but then the business can then grow loans 20% and chase yield and go after riskier asset classes and still be within risk appetite. So that metric doesn't make sense. Do you then set a band for that kind of metric, saying I want to grow between 9 and 12%? Well, we don't really like bands when we set risk appetite. So you ultimately go through this kind of iterative approach and you see that it just doesn't work until you say, maybe a better metric is, let me track loan growth in excess of the market and set that less than X%, or new loans with a weaker risk rating profile relative to our current book, less than Y%. But having the requisite data can be another challenge to turning an idea or a concept into a metric that you could actually track on a weekly or monthly basis. The other challenge with metrics is focusing on those that are more forward-looking, key risk indicators or KRIs, as opposed to backwards-looking KPIs. We tried for an 80-20, 90-10 kind of split.
I would not have thought about using outside variables in a metric like the first one you were describing about over the market. That's really a creative way to tackle the problem of are we getting out of line with our peers? Are we getting out of line with the market? Are we deviating from where we see ourselves in the financial sector? So that's an impressive way to think about metrics that I'm usually thinking internally of, well, what can we generate or benchmark against? But looking at some of the peers that way, that's another approach that I like that one. Well, Dan, I really want to thank you for being with us today on Credibly Challenged. It has been great talking with you. I think our audience has learned a lot about how to broaden your portfolio of risk and how to grow with the changing trends in risk management around some of these issues like quantification of risk identification, and also materiality. And so I really want to thank you for those insights. I also want to thank our listeners. We, again, wouldn't be here without you, and we appreciate you tuning into us. Please stay tuned for next month's edition.
Thank you.